Good morning, afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to this first of two webinars co-hosted by the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, the CRFM, and the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, the GGGI, on abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear in the Caribbean region. This will be the first of a pair of webinars that we hope to host, the first one being today, the second one being 1 month from today, where we talk about the issue of lost and abandoned fishing gear, or ghost gear as it's colloquially known, in the Caribbean region, talk about some of the work that's been done there today with a few esteemed speakers who I'll be introducing in a moment, as well as talking about a regional action plan to address lost and abandoned fishing gear in the Caribbean region, with the hope that we can get some feedback from those of you who are on the line today to feed into that document and grow that document and make sure that we are taking everyone's feedback into consideration as we do that. And then the second session briefly will be about the development of that work plan, taking some of that feedback into consideration and having a general discussion about how to improve it, just to sort of frame everyone as to what we're doing here today. And just to note of housekeeping that this meeting will be recorded. So for those of you who are just joining now, the meeting will be recorded for posterity. Terrific. So we have, as I said, a terrific panel of speakers today for this webinar. We have Dr. Sandra GRANT, the Executive Director of the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, myself, the Associate Director of the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, Shellene BERRY, the Senior Director for the Capture Fisheries Extension Services of the National Fisheries Authority in Jamaica, Dr. Daana KANHAI, Scientist and Lecturer, Department of Life Services at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago, and Ms. Fadilah Ali, Assistant Executive Director for the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute, the GCFI, based in Florida. So I'll move through a brief introduction for each of those speakers, then I'll hand it over to Dr. GRANT for a welcome as well. Dr. GRANT has over 30 years of experience working in the fisheries sector throughout the Caribbean. She became the Deputy Executive Director of the CRFM Secretariat in June of 2021 and has been acting as the Executive Director since January of 2025, previously working with the CARICOM Fisheries Unit, which later became the CRFM, as Data Manager and Analyst under the Caribbean Fisheries Resource Assessment and Management Program from 1999 to 2001. She holds a PhD in Natural Resources and Environmental Management from the University of Manitoba, Canada. Myself, the Associate Director for the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. In my previous life, I was a harbor manager for the largest commercial fishing harbor in Canada, and have participated in a lot of different technical working groups for the ASC Technical Advisory Group on Marine Litter, as well as an IUCN working group on developing a position paper for extended producer responsibility for fishing gear. Back in my days as the operations supervisor for Steveston Harbor, I started an end-of-life net recycling program, which is what led me to join the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, first as the Secretariat back in 2018 or 17, and then obviously I've evolved into the Associate Director role since then. And our next speaker, Mrs. Shellene BERRY, a dedicated results-driven social scientist, over 30 years of invaluable experience within the fisheries sector, a trained social worker with responsibility for capacity building of fisherfolk groups. She started out at the Jamaica Fisheries Division, which later became the National Fisheries Authority of Jamaica, the lead organizer on the Abandoned, Lost, Destroyed, and Discarded Fishing Gear project implemented during 2019 to 2023, with whom we worked very closely over that period of time. She's also the gender mainstreaming focal point for Jamaica to the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. Welcome, Ms. BERRY. And Dr. Daana KANHAI. Dr. Daana's research is multidisciplinary, focusing on understanding human impact on coastal and marine ecosystems to advance the development of context-specific interventions that will contribute to ecosystem health and human well-being. She's conducted research in Trinidad and Tobago, the Arctic Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, and the Caribbean Sea. Dr. KANHAI has published on the issue of marine debris and plastic pollution in the Caribbean Large Marine Ecosystem, or the CLME. She's a co-principal investigator of projects focused on the human dimension of plastic pollution in Trinidad and Tobago, and abandoned, lost, and otherwise discarded fishing gear in Trinidad and Tobago, marine megafauna in Trinidad and Tobago. Beyond research, Dr. KANHAI is involved in science and communication. And finally, Ms. Fadilah Ali, the Program Manager for the Caribbean Node of the Global Partnership on Plastic Pollution and Marine Litter, the GPML, which GCFI is a co-host together with the UN Environment. She's previously conducted research on biological indicators for water quality, as well as distribution and impact of marine debris on British coastlines. Fadilah is also an ecologist with a specialty in invasive species biology, control and management, and was heavily involved in research on the lionfish invasion within the Dutch Caribbean. To date, she's analyzed the stomach contents of more than 12,000 lionfish and has conducted research and worked as a consultant in many islands throughout the Caribbean, not to mention her work on ALDFG, which we've done with her and the GCFI for several years now. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Sandra GRANT for another brief introduction. Dr. GRANT.
Good morning, our distinguished guests, our panelists, and to all online. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the joint webinar of the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, CRFM, and the Ghost Gear Initiative, the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, GGGI. My name is Sandra GRANT, as Joel said, and I'm the Acting Executive Director at the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, Secretariat in Belize City. I am thrilled to welcome you to the first of a two-part series on abandoned, lost, and otherwise discarded fishing gear in the Caribbean, the challenges, the successes, and opportunities. Abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear, or ghost gear, continues to pose a significant threat to the fishery sector, and it is also a major source of aquatic pollution, threatening aquatic species and the environment, as well as food security, both in the Caribbean and globally. To address this problem, CRFM and GGGI signed a Memorandum of Understanding on the 8th of September in 2023 as part of their collaborative efforts to combat the growing negative impacts of ALDFG across the Caribbean. The agreement formalizes the partnership between the CRFM and GGI, which began in 2018. The CRFM Ministerial Council also affirmed its commitment and noted the strong link between ghost gear and illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. Established in 2015, GGGI, led by Ocean Conservancy, is a leading global platform for addressing the problem of ALDFG, and it consists of 136 participant organizations from around the world, with the official support of 20 governments, joined by the Caribbean countries, which now support the initiative through the CRFM. GGGI has been conducting active ALDFG prevention, mitigation, remediation, predictive modeling, and capacity sharing work in Belize, Grenada, Jamaica, Montserrat, and Trinidad and Tobago. In 2022, the CRFM collaborated with GGGI and the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute to develop this Caribbean Regional Action Plan to prevent ALDFG. Now, this seminar aims to discuss efforts to address ALDFG in the Caribbean and to gather further background on the draft Caribbean Regional Action Plan, as Joel has outlined it before. Now, the first session will set the stage and provide this background information on actions and the development of the Caribbean Action Plans. And then we have the second session, which will focus on the policy framework. Today, however, we focus on the work done by GGGI in the Caribbean and provide examples of implementation at the national level. We will also remind our audience of the development of this Caribbean Regional Action Plan that provides strategic guidance for a coordinated approach to managing ALDFG across the region through a variety of relevant best practices across prevention, mitigation, and remediation strategies. We welcome GGGI, who will present on their work in the Caribbean, but we also welcome our panelists, whom Joel has ably presented before, and they will present their experience in addressing this issue. And finally, to all our participants online, from near and far, again, I say welcome. and to what I hope would be a spirited conversation on how our region can collectively address one of the most harmful forms of marine debris. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grant, for that stirring welcome and introduction. Really appreciate that. And we will, one other quick note of housekeeping. If you have any questions, for the purpose of flow, we will move through the presentations one after another. But we do have a Q&A panel that you can open if you're on the bottom of your Zoom window. You will see a Q&A button. If you can put any questions that you have in there, then we can make sure that we answer those in the moderated discussion part towards the end of the webinar after the presentations have taken place. So please use the Q&A session. We will be monitoring both that and the chat, but it would be much easier for those of us who are trying to do that while running the webinar if we could use the Q&A session where possible. And with that, we will jump into the first presentation. Again, Joe Basic, the Associate Director for the GGGI. I'll just give an overview of the work that the Global Ghost Gear Initiative has done in the region, and then after that we will have our distinguished panelists speak about some of the work that they have done, some of which was in coordination with the GGGI, some of which independent of, to give sort of a broad understanding and overview of the work that has been done on this topic in this region to date, of course with the hope that more will be done. So first of all, to orient folks to understand what exactly is the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, or the GGGI. As Dr. Grant mentioned, housed under Ocean Conservancy, the GGGI is the only cross-sectoral alliance committed to driving solutions to the problem of lost and abandoned, otherwise discarded fishing gear worldwide. What that means is essentially that we are an organization that brings together groups from around the world to tackle this problem from a variety of different perspectives and with a variety of different skill sets. So we have academic members, we have NGOs, we have seafood industry, we have retailers, technology companies, those who are doing gear removal. It really is a sort of a one-stop shop and a safe space for people to join from around the world to sort of unite under this one banner and drive work forward along to address this problem on a global scale. And as you can see, we do have a global reach, a snapshot down there of 148 member organizations around the world of varying sizes, 24 member governments. You can see the flags of the associated nations there who are official government signatories to the GGGI, 7 ongoing signature projects from the world, one of which is in the Caribbean, which we'll be talking about today. And we've done 30 small grant projects around the world, although we've just closed another round of small grants and that number probably needs to be updated. And the key aims of the GGGI are to improve the health of aquatic ecosystems, protect aquatic life from harm, and safeguard human health and livelihoods. All of those things are equally important. This is about understanding that there are multiple reasons for gear loss around the world. This is not about vilifying the fishing industry in any way, shape, or form. It's about trying to understand what these key causes of gear loss might be, and trying to find solutions that work for everyone, which is part of why we are having webinars like this today, is to hear from those who are involved in the industry as well as from other related sectors around the world to try to find lasting solutions through prevention, mitigation, and remediation. Countries that we have done work in the GGGI's Caribbean Signature Project, as Dr. Grant already mentioned, are Belize, Grenada, Jamaica, Montserrat, Trinidad and Tobago, and some of our implementing partners. I don't think that that is an exhaustive list, but some of the folks that we've worked with today, and some of whom are on the line here today to give presentations as well. So we are trying to do as much work as we can in the region and involving as many local organizations as we can. I'll just briefly go over some of the things that we have done in each of our regions, but some of the key activities that we've been implementing in each of those countries include capacity building regional workshops, some of which have been virtual like this back in the COVID era. Many of the planned workshops that we had planned to do in person ended up being regional workshops virtually, but we have would like to continue to do that to raise awareness about the issue. Some fisher surveys, which we'll go into more detail in not only in this presentation, but in others from our panelists as well, trying to get an understanding from the fisher folk in the region about what are the key losses for, or sorry, the key drivers for gear loss, the key reasons, what they see as potential solutions, as well as some ALDFG predictive modeling, which we've done for, I think, each of those countries that we've worked in, to try to get an understanding of, based on that information, mitigation, and based on some of the other factors, environmental conditions, benthic conditions, fishing practices, etc. What is likely to happen given all of those different variables in any given location to sort of come up with a predictive map of where gear is likely to be lost for the purposes of informing policy decisions, but also informing removal work in the future. We've done some technology testing, which Ms. Berry will go into in a little bit more detail in her presentation. In particular, most of that happened in Jamaica, testing out new technologies to see whether or not there are ways that technology can assist in the prevention of gear loss in Caribbean fisheries specifically, some of which worked very well, others were maybe not as well suited to the region, but I'll let Ms. Berry go into that in a little more detail later on. UAV surveys and machine learning. So trying to detect lost and abandoned fishing gear from the air using UAVs or unmanned aerial vehicles, and then trying to come up with a machine learning algorithm to automatically detect gear when it's located and tag that gear so you're not having to go through thousands of images if there are folks rather flying UAVs around. So it's an ongoing piece of work, but we trialed it in a couple of places in the Caribbean. And outreach and education, obviously critically important to make sure that people are aware of the issue and aware of the impacts and how they might be able to contribute to prevention, mitigation, or remediation strategies in their local context. And drafting, of course, the ALDFG Regional Action Plan, which has been mentioned several times already, and a copy of which can be found in the materials for the webinar. First of all, in Belize, we did some capacity building workshops, again, virtually, fisher surveys, which you can see the Belize National Fisheries Authority conducting with fisher folk there in Belize. We also did a predictive model based on that and some aerial imaging to try to understand where gear distribution was as well. Outreach and education was critically important. And in Belize specifically, we found that the situation there was quite different than it was in Jamaica, where we were also working at the time, as well as Grenada, being a very shallow water environment for most of the fishers that were fishing in the archipelago, had a very different approach to fishing in terms of the gear that was used and in terms of the methodologies that were used, even though they were fishing the same species. And this will come into play quite prominently when we talk about the regional action plan and some of the differences that we encountered, even when fishing occurs in inter-island for the same species. In Grenada, we focused on capacity building workshops again, as well as fisher surveys, predictive models, outreach and education, a very similar body of work to what we did in Belize, using a consultant on the ground to go and speak to fisher folk and implement some of these surveys designed by FAO to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO surveys, to understand what the key causes of gear loss in Grenada were, with the hopes of feeding into this regional action plan, which we mentioned earlier. In Jamaica, I think it's probably safe to say we carried out our largest body of work, again, with more workshopping, fisher surveys, predictive models. The technology testing, again, I won't get into a lot of detail here simply because I want Ms. Berry to be able to go into a little bit more detail in her presentation on that, and as well as UAV surveys and machine learning, as well as outreach and education, which is pretty much consistent across the body of work here. You'll see the Jamaica Environment Trust doing a cleanup along one of the beaches, prioritizing abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear in that photo there. And Shellene has more photos of the work that was done in Jamaica in her presentation as well. But I think to date, it's been our largest body of work. We tried to be as comprehensive as possible, and hoping that we can continue that body of work in the future. In Montserrat, who was the first official government to join the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, we did focusing again on capacity building workshops virtually, fisher surveys, predictive models, outreach and education, the same sort of base body of work, I would call it, that we were looking to do in the region, because you need to establish and understand the baselines and what's actually happening out there before you can start just diving into the water and doing gear removals, for example, or any of that work that usually comes further on down the line. So this is sort of a part of our project blueprint, if you will, to go in and get a better understanding of what's happening. Montserrat was an interesting one because there's a very steep continental shelf not far off, and it turned not far off of the mainland, and it turned out that a lot of gear loss that was being experienced there was due to the proximity of that continental shelf. And if any type of weather or current moves that gear, especially bottom set gear, towards that shelf, and once it hits that shelf, it's gone, and you're never going to find it again. And it's a very, very steep, very, very deep situation on the south side of that shelf. So removal efforts in the future are going to be quite difficult, and that's one of the considerations you need to take is it even worth it at that point? So more research needs to be done, but a bit of a unique situation there in Montserrat. And finally, Trinidad and Tobago. I won't go into too much detail here, as Dr. KANHAI has a lot more detail in her presentation about some of the work that we jointly did here. Again, focused on capacity building workshops, fisher surveys, predictive modeling. We did more UAV surveys and machine learning to train the model to detect lost and abandoned fishing gear from the air, which was quite a bit more successful because we had more imagery to go with from the work that we had previously done in Belize and Grenada. So quite a successful, you'll see one of the aerial images there, quite a successful trial of that project. I'm looking to expand that in the future as well. And as a brief overview of some of the work that we've done in the Caribbean, again, I think there's more detail to come in the presentations from the other presenters. So there will be more questions and there will be more answers over the next few presentations that go into a little bit more detail in each of those regions. So thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, please pop them into the Q&A, and my contact information is there for anyone who needs it. And with that, I will pass it off to our next speaker. Shellene, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My topic is a case study on the Jamaica experience in addressing abandoned, lost, and otherwise discarded fishing gear. The issue of abandoned, lost, discarded, and otherwise fishing gear, ALDFG, otherwise known as ghost fishing, is a phenomenon that, while it's not new, has been introduced as a concept to the fishing industry over the past 10 years or less. This phenomenon has no doubt affected fishers in the Caribbean, and more specifically the fishers of Jamaica and other countries of the world. And in 2019, I think that was the first time I heard of this phrase. And so the National Fisheries Authority in Jamaica has recognized this issue as an ongoing problem and has embarked upon a project entitled the Ghost Fishing Project to help address the issue. To combat the problem, various initiatives has been introduced in Jamaica, and these include: one, participation in a regional workshop, which was organized by the FAO through the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, GGGI, in Panama. There was another project that was introduced, a pilot project with the Ocean Conservancy Incorporation to introduce and test new gear technology. So in 2021, a survey on ghost gear was conducted with fishers and other stakeholders on the knowledge of lost gears. And there was also an online workshop which was conducted because, as Joel had said, that was during the time of COVID. And we were also introduced to a device known as RescueNet that aids to prevent lost gears by activating as a combination of emergency escape hatch and locator buoy. And with this project, we tested and also distributed RescueNets. There was another project under the ocean gear technology, which was introduced, but this project, the technology was found not to be well suited for the Jamaican fishers. We also did a series of public education sessions because, as I said, the concept was new to Jamaica, and this NFA staff had to visit various distributing sites to let others know what ghost gear was. And for the majority of the site, the fishers were unaware, and they had to be educated to the causes and consequences. Information on the methods used to combat this phenomenon, such as the new gear technology, which was the RescueNet, and the ocean gear technology, was also discussed. Participants for the testing were all licensed and registered fishers within the fishing industry and were randomly chosen to test the gears. Approximately 52 fishers, which included males, 50 males, 2 females, and the National Fisheries Authority, benefited from the rescue nets. There was a pre-test that was done where participants were asked to complete a rescue net survey. And with this survey, we wanted to ascertain information about their fishing practices. The result of the survey reviewed that most fishers considered ghost gear to be a significant problem within their respective area. Majority of the fishers use single pot traps to fish in an average depth of 40 to 100 feet of water. Pots are normally soaked from 1 to 8 days, with the majority being 3 days, and fishers spend between 3 to 8 hours fishing per day, with most fishers setting between 20 to 100 pots per set. And on an average, 10 pots would have been lost on any fishing trip. The testing and distribution of gear. 6 sites were chosen for testing and distribution of the rescue nets. The sites were chosen for testing were based on the location visited previously by our consultant, Mr. Nobi of the rescue net, on an earlier visit to the island in May of 2022, where he came to Jamaica and we had tested an older version of the rescue net. And this version was using a biodegradable cotton or rod cord to activate the device. The newer version, however, used an electric time release to deploy the units. And here you have a map showing the various parishes in which the rescue nets were distributed. A total of 139 rescue nets were distributed across the island. And we basically touched almost every parish. We have 14 parishes in Jamaica, and we basically touched all the parishes. And here are pictures of the distribution that took place. So the fishers are very happy in getting the gear. It was a gear that was well received, and they said it was long awaited. More gears. And so after the testing, we also did a post test. So after evaluating the gear, information was gathered on how the rescue unit worked and the quality of its execution. There were some positive feedbacks. One, the installation of the RescueNet app was quite easy using the Google App Store. The app was easy to find and did not require any Wi-Fi connectivity nor phone data. Fishers reported that the device surfaced precisely at the scheduled time, and fishers were enthusiastic about the unit and believed this technology was long overdue. Fishers agreed that if they had this technology years ago, they could have prevented many of their gears from being lost, and all agreed that this is something that they would use. So along with positives, there are also negatives, right? So fishers expressed that the unit would not work well in fishing ground of depths 200 fathom or greater, and that there were concerns about the durability of the unit, whether they would stand strong in turbulent weather and the currents in specific areas. They also feared that they might not be able to retrieve their pots on time when the units popped up, which could leave their pots exposed to predators. And the cost of the gear was another issue, in that the majority expressed that they could only afford the gears if the gear was sold between $15 to $25 US each. The challenges that we had with this gear, though, was, even though it was a very good gear, it's very good, some minor challenges was that in using the app, based on your version of your Android phone, the display of the app would appear different. And newer versions of the Android was able to display all the features associated with the app, whereas an older version, such as a Galaxy A52, did not display all the features, especially when the check status button was selected. And no issue was found with the people who use the iPhone, and this model phone seems to have been the best option in installing the app. And based on that problem with the installation and the different features, we found that most persons still have not used their rescue nets because they're unable to download the app. But for the majority of those who had a newer version of the Android, they are using their rescue nets and they find it to be very useful. And their only concern is that they needed somewhere in Jamaica where they could buy it. So we're hoping that in the future, more distributing stores will be available where persons are able to buy these products. And with that said, my presentation is very short, but I thank you for the opportunity for sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shellene. That was great. Thank you for the in-depth overview there. You did a much better job of it than I would have, so I appreciate that. And with that, we'll move on to the next presentation a little bit early ahead of schedule, but that's always a good thing, means more time for discussion. And next, I believe we have Dr. KANHAI.
Great, thanks very much, Joel. Warm greetings from the Southern Caribbean, everyone. This morning, I'm very delighted to have an opportunity to share some of the work that we have been doing as it relates to this issue of abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear here in Trinidad and Tobago. I am one of the members of a multidisciplinary team, and as I go on in the presentation, I will highlight the contributions of the other members. Now, I throw you back to the year 2021. We were in the middle of the pandemic, and I attended virtually the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute, their annual conference. And I was in the marine litter technical session. And within that session, I was presenting work on what we knew about marine debris and microplastics in the Caribbean large marine ecosystem. And we had 40 years of data, and I was presenting this. And I remember saying very clearly that we know a lot about land-based sources of pollution, but we knew very little about marine sources of pollution. In that session, my two co-panelists were Dr. Tricia Lovell from Antigua and Barbuda and Joel Basic from the GGGI. And I listened very intently because both Tricia and Joel at that time were presenting on work on this issue of ALDFG in the Caribbean region. And I thought to myself, well, why isn't Trinidad and Tobago one of the countries that's doing this work? And so a seed was planted essentially. In 2021, myself and Isabel Richter, from one of my collaborators, an environmental psychologist from Norway, we got a grant from the Royal Society to look at the human dimension of plastic pollution in Trinidad and Tobago. And I convinced Isabel to use some of that funds to address this issue of ALDFG, but we didn't have enough money. And so after a couple of conversations with Joel, we were finally able to secure a small grant from Ocean Conservancy. So finally, we had enough money to do what we wanted to do. Now, sometimes you don't have to invent the wheel is already there, right? I say that because we were aware that FAO already had this global ALDFG survey that was ongoing. And so we were introduced to a fisheries expert by the name of Haraldur Eneson from Iceland, Halli as we call him. And Halli would have provided training to our team to use this FAO instrument to collect data from fishers. And one of the first things that Halli asked us to get information on would have been the number of vessels in the country that would have been using specific types of gear. Now, we didn't have that information, and so we had to reach out to the local fisheries division. So I must acknowledge both the fisheries division from the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, as well as the Division of Food Security, Natural Resources, the Environment and Sustainable Development in Tobago. We had tremendous support from them, and based on the data that they gave us, it was quite apparent that there were three dominant categories of gear that were being used in Trinidad and Tobago. So we had gill nets, we had traps, the fish pots, and hooks and lines. And so what we then proceeded to do was we proceeded to interview fishers across Trinidad and Tobago. The green dots that you're seeing, those are the landing sites where fishers were interviewed. The red, those were sites where fishers were not interviewed. But at this point, I just want to pause and acknowledge the input of fishers. If fishers did not take these surveys, we would have no data. And there's a lovely quote coming from Woods the Lagoon that says, if you ignore fishers' knowledge, you miss the boat. So we had 359 artisanal fishers all across Trinidad and Tobago that took our survey. I also acknowledge at this point the team of fieldwork assistants that went out into the field to get these surveys done. So they would have done this opportunistically, meaning that they just showed up at a landing site and whoever was willing to be interviewed, they took the surveys, okay? Now, I didn't mention this before, but one of my areas of research really focuses on this issue of plastic pollution in the marine environment. And so for me, I really wanted to be able to estimate the amount of plastic waste entering the marine environment as a result of ALDFG. Based on the FAO instrument, we were able to do this using two methods. And so you would see me present a graphic showing you the direct method as well as the indirect method. And this is from a single vessel. So what this is showing us is that more plastic waste is entering the marine environment from the use of gill nets, than hooks and lines, than traps. This trend is also very apparent with the indirect method. It's just that the indirect method, the estimates are much higher. All right, this is from a single vessel. What we then did was that we scaled this up to try to estimate how much plastic waste might be entering the marine environment from all the vessels that are using these different types of gear. So we are able to have estimates for the entire, all the artisanal vessels. Now, you might ask, well, why is this information important? Very often you would find that countries are engaged in doing materials flow analyses for plastics, and this data is not yet incorporated into those materials flow analyses. So for Trinidad and Tobago, one was done in 2016 by one of my colleagues, Dr. Shellene BERRY from COSTAT, and this type of waste was not included in that, right? So very important information. The other thing that we wanted to do, so what that first objective indicated to us was, okay, we had a problem, but we wanted to understand what was causing this problem. So I have three of these tables, and I can't, because of time, I don't have time to go into detail to what they're showing, but I just want you to pay attention to where the red dots are. We wanted to understand what's causing gear loss, whether it be for gill nets, hooks and lines, and traps. And what we started seeing was that we had factors that were coming up for all the gear types. So these factors would have been things like bad weather, damage or being towed away by large animals, lack of communication between vessels, gear drifting out of the accessible area. Trinidad and Tobago, so this is the slide here for gill nets. This shows you hooks and lines, and this shows you traps. So many of these factors are repeated amongst the different gear types. Trinidad and Tobago is not unique on the regional scale or even on the global scale as it relates to this, because fishers, for example, that were interviewed by Dr. Tricia Lavelle in Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica, they have reported similar issues as being responsible for gear being lost. At the international level, we've had work done by Dr. Kelsey Richardson, and again, she's interviewed fishers from multiple countries globally, and these are issues that are coming up. For the Caribbean region, as it relates to, I'll just make a comment about maybe two of these causes. So, you know, the poor weather conditions, in the context of a changing climate, the intensity and the frequency of hurricanes are projected to increase, right? And so that's something that we should be concerned about. This issue of damage or gear being damaged or towed away by large animals. For example, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have turtles that are nesting. So our nesting season is from March to August of every year. These turtles are coming, the female turtles are coming to nest on our shores. And of course, they're interacting with gear, right? I can speak much more about this, but I'll just move on to the next slide. I show you these images here because what the image on the left shows you is that it shows you what the causes of gear loss would be. But on the right-hand side, what you're seeing is that fishers are already actively taking action to avoid gear loss. So the green tells you that they're always taking action to avoid gear loss. And what it means to say is that for some of these causes, not all the fishers, because on the x-axis you're seeing proportion of the fishers that were interviewed, not all of the fishers are taking action. So we do have positive things, yes. Some fishers are taking action to avoid gear loss, not all are, right? And then these would be repeated amongst the different gear types. What I did want to mention is that we went a step further. So we had to think in terms of if we had to triage which issues need to be addressed immediately, can we calculate a risk level and then address those where the risk levels are highest? So for example, for gill net loss, you're seeing vandalism there, lack of communication, gear intentionally discarded. Those are the ones with the highest risk levels. For hooks and lines, you're seeing faulty gear, lack of communication between vessels as being quite high risk levels, right? So I can go into some more detail about this, but we do have a way to prioritize for these multiple factors, which ones potentially should be addressed first. The other thing we did, so we went a little bit beyond the existing FAO ALDFG questionnaires. We asked a couple more questions. So one of the questions we asked fishers would have been, where are you losing gear? So the image to the left of the screen shows you the locations for where gill nets are being lost, hooks and lines, and traps. And you're seeing that fishers are losing gear on almost all of the coasts, right? But pay attention to the white arrows. Those white arrows are showing you the direction in which currents are flowing, the dominant currents are flowing around Trinidad and Tobago. So for example, many of these locations where fishers are losing gear, they're in the path of these dominant currents. And what this means is that this is not an issue that is restricted to Trinidad and Tobago's EEZ. This is really going to be a trans-boundary issue because gear that is lost by fishers from Trinidad and Tobago will be transported to the EEZ of other Caribbean islands and eventually make its way into the Caribbean Sea. So that's very important to understand. Joel alluded to this earlier when he spoke, but we also asked fishers, do you know of locations where gear is presently located, whether that is an onshore location or an offshore location? And of course, fishers are giving us that information as well. And this sort of data can serve as a platform for removal efforts in the future. I just want to acknowledge my collaborator, Hamish Asmat from the Institute of Marine Affairs, who actually engaged in this participatory mapping work with us, okay? Just to say that fishers are aware that this is a problem, so it's not news to them. They've indicated that over the past 10 years, they've seen ALDFG increasing, and they already have recommendations for things that they think we could do to avoid or reduce ALDFG. I can come back to this, but fishers have recommendations. The last thing that I want to speak on in terms of the work that we did is that, remember, I told you in 2021, Dr. Tricia Lovell sat with me on a marine litter technical session panel for the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute conference. Well, I remember Tricia, and what I asked her to do, I said, Tricia, would you collaborate with us on this project? What Tricia has done in the Eastern Caribbean, she's done a lot of great stuff as it relates to ALDFG, but one of the things that she's done is that she started doing these gap analyses. So looking at the legislative, the regulatory, and the policy framework for countries to see, do they have the things that are necessary to manage ALDFG, right? And so for Trinidad and Tobago, you know, we have signed on to many conventions, and so there's strong support for global ocean governance. However, our current regime, we have some work to do. So we have a Fisheries Act that is dated, right? However, in progress right now is the Fisheries Management Bill 2023. When that in itself, when it becomes primary legislation at some point in the future, that has provisions to put in place subsidiary legislation to take action to either prevent, to mitigate, or even to remediate in certain instances, right? So we are not where we want to be, but I think we're on the way to getting there. So this information, of course, will be coming out quite soon in one of our publications. Just to end off, I know I'm going over time, but just to end off to say that in Trinidad and Tobago, we recognize that we have a problem. We recognize that this problem is not restricted to our EEZ. It's actually a transboundary problem. But as you can see, we've collected in a systematic manner information about ALDFG, right? Right now, there are projects that are underway in the country. So one of the first projects is this project, the capacity development to catalyze action and commitments at the national and global level to reduce plastic pollution in the marine environment. That's a project. The focal point is the Ministry of Planning and Development right now. So that is underway, and that project specifically targets plastic pollution at a national level. Trinidad and Tobago is one of the only Caribbean countries that's on this particular project. And then at a more regional level in the Southern Caribbean, there's the BAZUIK project, a project that tries to address the issue of bycatch, but also embedded within it is this focus on this issue of abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear. So Trinidad and Tobago is one of 4 countries that's currently involved in this project. So I end here, but quite happy to have deeper conversations with people as well as answer some questions in the Q&A segment.
Thank you very much, Dr. KANHAI, for that in-depth presentation. We're actually ahead of time even now, so we will probably have a chance to go through that in a little bit more detail and answer some questions. I see there's already a couple in the chat. I think we'll stick to our original plan of just moving ahead with the presentations so that we don't interrupt the flow, but thank you. Those questions in the chat, I can see they are acknowledged, and they will be the first ones that we get to when the presentations are concluded and we enter the discussion part. So thank you very much. And with that, our next speaker is Fadilah Ali from the GCFI. Fadilah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joel. So thank you, everyone. Today I'll be presenting a case study on the role of the GCFI in addressing ALDFG. And just for a bit of context, the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute was founded in 1947 to promote the exchange of information on the use and management of marine resources in the Gulf and Caribbean region. And it is a very unique organization, and it's comprised of scientists, academics, students, fishers, managers, government, civil society, and various other stakeholders who share a very common interest in the sustainability and advancement of the conservation of marine resources within the region. So just wanted to provide a little bit of that perspective, since we've been mentioning GCFI throughout, but quite a few people might not actually know. And so one thing that was mentioned is that GCFI is the co-host of the Global Partnership on Plastic Pollution and Marine Litter of the Caribbean Node. And this is an important partnership for both national and regional organizations, as well as governments, research and technical agencies, as well as any other individuals or stakeholders that are primarily focused on reducing the quantity as well as the impact of marine litter within the wider Caribbean region. And the work of the node directly supports governments in meeting any national, regional, and global agendas. And it's also been very instrumental, most recently, in the internationally legally binding instrument to essentially end plastic pollution. And as mentioned, GCFI serves as the co-host of the GPML3 with the Secretariat of the Cartagena Convention. And so what we're beginning to recognize through this webinar is that targeting ALDFG is really all about partnerships. So as Joel, Shellene, Dr. KANHAI, Dr. Grant have already mentioned, there's several activities that have been ongoing within this region. And specifically, GCFI has been collaborating very heavily with GGGI on our ALDFG work. As is going to be discussed after this, GCFI together with GGGI and CRFM developed a regional ALDFG action plan back in 2021. We have also collaborated with GGGI to do baseline and modeling of hotspot locations so far within the region in Belize, Mexico, Grenada, Jamaica, Montserrat, and Trinidad and Tobago, as you would have seen in some of the previous presentations. The GARE testing work was also done in partnership, as Shellene's presentation showed. We've also done some UAV surveys and developing neural networks to detect ghost scan images captured by UAVs, especially through the use of drones, which is really helpful in using limited resources to go ahead and remove these ALDFG. Another important thing that I'll mostly be focusing on today is the development of communication products targeted at various stakeholders, specifically in this presentation, policymakers and decision makers, as well as fishers, and how we've used these communication products to implement through official-led awareness program. And through some of the lessons learned through these awareness programs, we also developed, we also hosted a virtual workshop on some of the solutions for end-of-life fishing gear, which was held back in March 2023. And so when we developed the regional action plan for ALDFG, we recognize the usefulness of it. It is a very rich document that provides a lot of information. However, we recognize that policymakers don't like to read a lot of large documents. And so we found that it was important to develop a brief for policymakers, which essentially takes all of this rich, very important information and digests it into a shorter product. And so we liaised with Dr. Tricia Lavelle, who is an ALDFG expert from the region. She is from Antigua and Barbuda, and she completed her PhD in Norway or Sweden. And we liaised with her to conduct a literature review and also to develop this brief for policymakers. And what we did was that we wanted to develop targeted communication products and messages from this action plan. And through this work, she identified an important three-pronged approach to prioritizing ALDFG governance within fisheries management systems. And in terms of this three-pronged approach, it was found that, firstly, there's need for national risk assessments to improve the understanding of these local circumstances related to ALDFG, and this can be done by integrating fisher interviews and national stakeholder workshops to provide insight into what are the local drivers of gale loss, as well as this associated likelihood and risk. And some of this was sort of covered in Dr. KANHAI's previous presentations in terms of the fisher interviews that they would have conducted. Secondly, there's need for there to be legislative and policy reviews to identify these key gaps in legislation, and then also to assess policy coherence across the various sectors, whilst also identifying weaknesses in the management regime. And finally, there's need for there to be ALDFG management plans, which will then go on to guide these national risk assessments, to propose legislative reforms, and then identify in the legal and policy review. There's also best practice guidance provided in the regional framework document. These national management plans should also align with any policy directives codified in regional marine litter policies. And then, so that was sort of a little snippet of the policymakers, which was a subset of stakeholders that we chose to focus on. Secondly, a very important subset of stakeholders that we prioritized were the fishers. And within GCFI, we have something known as the Fisheries for Fishers initiative. And this initiative is founded on the principle that fishers must be engaged as well as empowered to be part of the process of managing marine resources. Within GCFI, we have something known as the Gladden Memorial Award, the GMA, which is awarded annually and recognizes a fisher within the Gulf and Caribbean region who, through example, demonstrates a long-term conservation ethic. So far, as of 2024, we have 26 individuals throughout the region, including 3 women. We have 3 women GMA winners from 19 countries who have received this award. Our most recent awardee was Mr. Richard Boyer from Haiti, and he has joined a great group of individuals. And for our work targeted towards fishers, GCFI, in partnership with GGGI, developed these communication products to raise awareness about ALDFG and to promote the adoption of best management practices for preventing and reducing the impact of ALDFG. Like the policymakers, we use the information within a regional action plan to make it more digestible and in a more visual way targeted towards fishers. And these fact sheets were funded by a grant that we had from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and were prepared in English, Spanish, and French, which are the major languages of the Caribbean. And on the screen here, we have examples of the communication products. And so on the right was a larger sort of A1 size poster, which was intended to be used more for outside of co-ops, landing sites, any sort of public place where fishers would be. And then we had a sort of smaller poster series, which was A4 size, which could be used as handouts, something that the fishers can take back home with them, as well as within the Caribbean, the reality is everyone is a fisher. So we didn't just target the people that are going out on fishing boats, we also targeted local communities as well as schools. And these smaller posters were also helpful in sharing that information. So our process was, first of all, I want to again acknowledge our funding from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And for our official-led ALDFG awareness program, we initially started with 2 countries. We utilized past GMA winners, past Gladden Memorial Award winners, and using these communication products, we had these GMA ambassadors go out to relevant fishing communities, markets, co-ops, schools to display and distribute communication products. And one of the reasons why we decided to use our fishers for this fisher-led ALDFG awareness program is that they are already recognized as champions or leaders within their local communities. And this was a great opportunity for them to educate others, build capacity, but then also have that peer-to-peer interaction, in that some fishers would be more responsive to speaking candidly with other fishers or the fishers that they recognize, rather than say, I were to go there as a foreigner to another country to conduct this education activity. Since we started this work, we have now completed this work in 5 countries. We initially started within the GCFI GMA network with St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as well as Grenada, which I'll share some case studies of. But we've also expanded this. In the photo there, we have Danny James from St. Lucia. We also conducted this work in Antigua and Barbuda with Devon Warner. And then most recently, last year in 2024, we had some funding through the Builders Initiative to expand this work in the Bahamas. And this was led by Adrian LaRota of the Bahamas Commercial Fisheries Alliance. And this work was expanded to islands in New Providence, Andros, Grand Bahama, Abaco, Acklins Islands, and Mayaguana. And so I'm just going to share 2 case studies of some of our official-led ALDFG awareness. So one of the first fishers we used was Cecil Marquez. He was the 2018 Gladden Memorial winner, and he's from Guyave in Grenada. And he was the first fisher to introduce longline technology in Grenada. And he also introduced larger vessels with cabins and popularized safety at sea training. And he was instrumental in establishing the Guyave MPA. And he continues to be an active conservationist and leader addressing marine debris through beach cleanups and education in local schools. And so Cecil would have done some great work in Grenada, going out to all the major co-ops, all the major landing sites, and especially interacting with all the schools and trying to get the younger up and coming fishers to be aware of the issue of ALDFG. And he also had some, in addition to our fishers educating other fishers about ALDFG, they were also able to gain knowledge about what the fishers that they were speaking to, what their level of awareness were, what they found. And one thing that Cecil mentioned is that there is a shift between the older fishers and the younger fishers, and that the older fishers are like, I've been doing this my whole life, why should I change now? The sea is there for me to throw things in and nothing has happened now, so why should I change? So it also shows where there is, while some of the younger fishers are seeing that change and seeing that their practices can't go on, there is a little bit of a difference between the older fishers and the younger ones. And Winsbert is an example of a younger fisher. Winsbert Harry was the 2019 Gladden Memorial Award winner, and he's from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He's currently the president of the St. Vincent National Fisherfolk Organization, and is also a part of the CNFO. And he's also an advocate for promoting safety at sea and promotes the use of technology and reducing vulnerabilities and building resilience to the impacts of climate change. And with Winsbert's interactions, he also found some differences between he reported on some different reactions as compared to those in Grenada. There's a little bit less awareness amongst the fishers in St. Vincent and the Grenadines as compared to Grenada. And he also reported on, there was a lot of acceptance and responsiveness to wanting to do something to protect, because for a lot of these fishers, they don't actually want to lose their fishing gear. Fishing gear is expensive, and lost fishing gear means the inability to then go on and fish, and it also means loss of income. So no one really wants to lose their fishing gear, and they're very interested in trying to find ways to prevent this from happening. And so therefore they were quite receptive. And some of the lessons learned from this activity was the value of peer-to-peer interactions. So having these fishers going out and speaking to each other meant that they were able to share information. And using these local champions allowed for there to be increased confidence and trust, and having those candid conversations and information exchange, which were captured in some of their reporting that they provided. And the use of fishers as compared to just using any other scientist or academic or as ambassadors is that using fishers as ambassadors really reflects their passion, because their livelihoods and sustainability is dependent on the health of the ocean. So they really want to protect the ocean because their livelihood depends on it. And now through this work that we started, we've now piloted this work in 5 countries. And through this, we've started to build a network where now these fishers can also share their experiences with each other, and then with other future fish ambassadors that we may expand with. And so some additional lessons learned. And so while there are several established best practices related to proper disposal of end-of-life fishing gear, the lack of these facilities within the Caribbean is a major obstacle. In collaboration with the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, some initial feasibility studies were done within the Caribbean to look at the feasibility of having some sort of facility to focus on the disposal of end-of-life fishing gear. And one of the issues within the Caribbean, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, is that the cost of transport between islands is somewhat ridiculous. You can get a flight to Miami cheaper than it is to fly 40 minutes from Trinidad to Grenada. And so there aren't a lot of existing shipping routes between these countries. And so the feasibility of having a central facility and then having these regional shipping routes to help with the disposal is a massive obstacle. And through this work and through our fishers talking with their local communities and other fishers, although the fishers are excited and motivated to do their part to reduce the incidence of ghost gear, the major challenge is, okay, so we lost our gear, we retrieved our nets, we retrieved our end-of-life fishing gear, and we brought it back. But now what? What do we do with it? Do we just leave it on the beach and then it can fall back into the water in an adverse weather event? So now one of the challenges of what to do with the end-of-life gear tends to be the issue. As I mentioned in my sort of introduction, we looked at what are the sort of local solutions that could be done. GGGI had some of their partners from other countries sort of share what is being done in terms of manipulating fishing line and rope to create things such as dog collars or anything that can be braided, or using fishing gear to make artwork. So some more work on that. It seems to be a needed priority, but it's an important step that we've established. And with that, I would like to thank you for attending this webinar. It's great to see such good interest in this topic, and I look forward to any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fadilah, for that great presentation, going into, again, so much more detail than I could have. That's terrific. And I think there are a few points that we'll want to pick up on in the discussion part of the webinar a little bit later on. And so we are still a little bit ahead of time, but again, that could just leave a little bit more room for discussion, Q&A. Please don't feel shy. If you'd like to answer or ask any questions, rather, please do so. I think another thing to point out before we jump into the last presentation, which I'll give very quickly, is just that the discussion point, we very much want this to be a discussion. So it's not just going to be necessarily the panelists answering questions about their presentations, although we will certainly do that. But I also want to hear from the folks that are on the line here as attendees as well. There are some questions that when we pose them, it would be great to have people's feedback from those who are out on the call here today. If you have some experiences with some of this, really what things can be considered. So please consider it a discussion. Just raise your hand if you'd like to contribute to that discussion when we reach that point. But quickly before we get there, there's one final presentation just to sort of set the scene for the regional action plan. And I will bring that up in just a moment. And this is really just to help frame the discussion for the next part of the webinar as well, and also leading into the discussion here. All right. So just to give a little bit of background context on this this regional action plan that's been mentioned a few times now. First of all, why a regional action plan? Well, I mean, there's a very simple answer to that question, which will come as a surprise to nobody that's on the line today, is that the Caribbean is an extremely diverse region with many different member states doing things slightly differently. Even fishing, when it comes to fishing in the same species with sometimes different gear types in very close proximity to one another. Dr. KANHAI also mentioned from her research that sort of current that's going through the Caribbean, or series of currents, which is going to transport gear from one region to another. So it's not just one. It's not just one part that's going to need to be dealt with. It's the entire thing as a whole. And I think we really need to recognize that no single approach is going to work everywhere. So when we were trying to come up with this regional action plan, it really was about trying to understand what some of these peculiarities and particularities of the region are, and trying to come up with a basic framework of how we can address some of these things, noting that not every recommendation is going to be applicable to every specific region. It's more about establishing a framework based on a couple of different things that can then be adapted to the local context. And so the Regional Action Plan in its current state is based on the Global Ghost Gear Initiative's CBPF, or the Best Practice Framework for the Management of Fishing Gear, which focuses on wild capture fisheries. That takes a very global approach. That document has a sort of a risk assessment by gear type, and broad gear type, I should say, and then looks at different stakeholder groups. I think there's about a dozen of them in that document. So from fishers and vessel owners themselves to technology companies and academia and policymakers and NGOs and et cetera, sort of tailored advice on how to deal with some of these issues in a global context. But again, this is a framework on a global context. We took some of the recommendations in there and tailored them slightly to the Caribbean region. However, as we've said, the Caribbean region is an extremely diverse region. Not exactly easy to do that. The GGGI has also made an attempt to do this for the APEC region, which is, arguably even more so. We really do need to take into consideration those local contexts, and trying to make a document that's applicable to everyone is a challenge. But at least getting feedback through webinars like this and some of the engagement that we've had earlier with GCFI and with others to try to get feedback into what this document is like, so that we can understand the situation on the ground and refine those recommendations, so that when policy briefs, for example, are being done, or there's talk of some of the knowledge and policy gaps that were talked about by both Dr. KANHAI and Fadilah in their presentations, where do we want to focus these efforts, and how do you create a sort of a tailored approach? It also incorporates some recommendations from the UNFAO's voluntary guidelines on the marking of fishing gear, which gear marking is seen as a way to not only prevent gear loss in terms of being able to see it on the surface of the water, so that it doesn't have interactions with other fishers or with other marine traffic, causing that to become lost and abandoned. But also being able to track where that gear is coming from. And again, this has been pointed out by other panelists, most recently Fadilah in her presentation, but this isn't about pointing blame. This is about understanding what the problem actually looks like. And gear marking can help us understand where some of that gear is coming from. How are some of those currents that Dr. KANHAI mentioned in her presentation, where are they carrying this gear to? Where's it coming from? How can we start to create some intervention points that might help mitigate these problems, especially when we're looking at critically sensitive habitats, of which there are obviously a great many in the Caribbean region. And this is not meant to be a replacement document of any sort. This is supposed to complement existing marine litter action plans and similar regional action plans that might already be in place, but that might not consider ALDFG or ghost gear as a specific element within those plans. So again, this is supposed to be a large-scale framework document that can be adopted to the local context based on the needs and based on the existing legislation or marine litter action plans that may already be present. And so some of the challenges have already been mentioned, but I'll just run through a couple of them. There was a general, and there still remains, I would argue, if you're talking about the Caribbean as a region, a general lack of data and research on this specific topic, because it tends to be the causes of lost and abandoned fishing gear tends to be quite distinct from those of other marine pollution issues. Your typical, when people are thinking of marine pollution and consumer plastics and things like that, the causes of lost and abandoned fishing gear tend to be quite distinct from those. So unless you have research being done specifically on that topic, of which there has been comparatively little done in the Caribbean region, then you're dealing with a lack of research and hard data to go on. Although we've tried, obviously, in some of our research and the projects that we've talked about to date to help mitigate that. Pardon me. And variation in local capacity to address the issue. This is true no matter where you go, but it's also true within the Caribbean. Sometimes that capacity is about resource capacity. Sometimes it's about general lack of understanding. Sometimes it's just that there's not a lack of, or that there's a complete lack of awareness, which we'll get into further on down the line. Others just haven't started work on this issue. Others that have are obviously building on work that's been done to date. So there is a significant variation in the ability of each individual member state to address this topic, and potentially even interest in or awareness of the topic. Also, variation in fisheries management measures. We realized this when we started doing work across the issue, in this issue across the region, where some member states just don't have the same level of fisheries management in place. And sometimes this is a capacity issue linking to the previous bullet. And sometimes it's just a lack of anything specific, as Dr. KANHAI had mentioned in her presentation, where there are just a lack of policies that address this particular issue, even when there is, robust fisheries management in place. So that type of variation also is a challenge to consider, because what works in one member state isn't necessarily going to work in another. We've also mentioned lack of options for end-of-life gear. This is a big issue in the Caribbean, I think. Fadilah mentioning that inter-island transport is significantly expensive, and we have islands dealing with waste streams. What is done with that waste? And end-of-life fishing gear, this is a problem in areas that do have robust waste management systems and transportation networks to send that waste where it needs to go, to where it can be processed. Even in situations like that, this is a big problem. It's, I think, amplified even more so in the Caribbean region, that there is just a lack of options for disposal of either end-of-life or recovered gear, apart from landfills, which, as we know, are rapidly filling up in many places. Variation in fishing practices and gear used, as I said, we learned this from doing work in the region, where you see different fishers from different member states targeting species with different gear types and different methodologies, even though, so what works for one particular region or one particular member state is not going to work in another. And then the lack of education and overall awareness of the issue. I think we've heard this from a couple of different presenters today as well, where there's just a general lack of awareness about the issue. I experienced this in my days working within the fishing industry here in Canada, as well, as that but fishers obviously know when they lose gear. That's obvious. As has been mentioned by Fadilah and myself earlier as well, nobody wants to lose their gear. That's a cost to them in a variety of different ways, not only to replace the gear that's been lost, which has a cost, but also the lost fishing potential. And so nobody wants that to happen, but what is actually happening under the water to the species upon which fishers rely, this is generally considered a giant unknown. And this shouldn't be a surprise, because most fishers don't spend a lot of time underneath the surface of the water, where they're actually seeing what's happening here. We've seen this in many parts of the world, where once fishers start to become involved in recovery projects, for example, and they're starting to pull up gear that is years old and has species in it that they are harvesting, that has been actively fishing over the course of that time, that's when that awareness and understanding starts to generally come in. But these types of awareness initiatives that Fadilah and others have mentioned, about making sure that it's the fishers who are leading on some of this and communicating with one another, is also critically important. So when it comes to the stakeholder guidance, I mentioned that our within the regional action plan, I mentioned earlier that our best practice framework documents target about a dozen different stakeholder groups. For this particular regional action plan, we decided to narrow the focus a little and focus on three in particular. So fishers and vessel operators, fisheries managers and regulators, and fisheries organizations, which would include fisherfolk organizations. The idea here is to make sure that the recommendations that are given are concise and they're targeted to those who are probably going to have, at the end of the day, at least initially, the largest potential impact to sort of prevent and mitigate the issue to the extent possible. And so the general approach was drafting the action plan, again, in collaboration with GCFI and CRFM, coming up with a draft based on the recommendations, generally speaking, that are in the GGGI's best practice framework. And then looking at stakeholder engagement process, which we did when it was originally released. So talking to fishers, fisheries managers, again, the CRFM and the GCFI, spreading it out through their networks to try to get as much feedback as possible. And then incorporating that feedback. And although that box there says final output, I want to stress that this document incorporated the feedback that we received. We would like to get more so that we can come up with an updated version of that document as well that takes some of that feedback into consideration. And it's always a delicate balancing act about providing guidance that will be useful to multiple stakeholder categories within the region, while also not being so specific because you can get really in the weeds. So it's about trying to find that right balance, but any and all feedback is welcome. And I think that we want to make sure that we're taking that into consideration from those who are experiencing this on the ground. And so the regional action plan is split into two sections. The first one is sort of a background and rationale of why we're doing this, an overview of Caribbean fisheries as was at the time. Probably that needs an update as well, and the rationale for sort of providing a regional action plan across the Caribbean to prevent ALDFG. And then the second section focuses on the actual gear class risk assessment based on the best practice framework from the GGGI and recommendations specifically focused across those different gear classes. So for example, there will be gill nets and fish aggregating devices and pots and traps, et cetera, and there'll be recommendations across those gear classes and then directed at those three stakeholder groups that we talked about earlier. And the guiding principle here, again, is that the actions that are recommended, whether that's through this regional action plan or anything that the GGGI does, they have to be, at least specifically the ones that are geared towards fishers, have to be simple, pragmatic, and affordable. We understand that, you can still have a guiding star of where you'd like to see things go, but at the end of the day, in order for fishers to adopt recommendations like these, whatever they might be, they need to be things they can realistically do so that they can continue to do what they do best, which is to, harvest seafood from the ocean in order to feed their families and to feed the rest of the world. So making sure that what we recommend is pragmatic, that it's affordable, that it's practical, it's not something that is just completely pie in the sky and not actually doable. And that's another reason why this type of interaction and getting feedback from folks in the room that are here today is so critically important. So again, just a snapshot of what this is all about. This is not just about the GGGI making recommendations. It's about getting those feedback from fisheries managers, from fishers, from local stakeholders in this sort of a cyclical pattern to make sure that the recommendations that are in there are applicable and that they're going to be useful in the long term and actually work towards preventing gear loss for the benefit of everyone. Because as we mentioned before, probably ad nauseum now, nobody wants to lose that gear. How do we find solutions to make sure that that doesn't happen in the first place? So I will end that presentation there, and we can start our discussion part of this webinar. So thank you very much. I don't know if our panelists would like to come back on camera and come off mute. We'll maybe start with the questions that we have in the Q&A session, and then we can move into a more open discussion from there. So the first question that I see in our Q&A panel is for Dr. KANHAI. You noted in your presentation that a cause of gear loss is lack of communication. Can you explain what you mean by lack of communication?
Yes, thanks, Joel. I can't see the questions, but just I'm not sure where they appear in it. Yes, so lack of communication between vessels. So I'll give you an example. We went, not we, the field, not me, but the field assistants went to Tobago. And some of the fishers in Tobago, they explained that, well, when they set out their gear in certain areas, you had other non-artisanal vessels. So these are not fishers. These are vessels that are operating in, for example, oil and gas. The oil and gas industry, they're probably transporting something. They're unaware that there's gear deployed in a certain area. And of course, what you will have happening is that that gear is going to be lost as a result of the interaction between this other vessel, a non-fishing vessel, and that gear. So of course, there's no indication that maybe that vessel would have been passing in that location. There's no communication between vessels. So that could be one example of a lack of communication between vessels. Another example could be a situation where you have, for example, somebody sets gill nets and somebody else is probably using hooks and lines or pots, and you have interactions between those two gear types. So there could be multiple things when we talk about a lack of communication between vessels.
Thank you, Dr. KANHAI. So it's about all vessels that are in the area, not just fishing vessels. It's about all of that different type of marine traffic in general.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question. Oh, sorry. Viren, I'm happy to have you ask your question.
Good day. If there's no other question, then can I go ahead?
There's a few in the chat, but I think we can get through them all. So I'm happy to have you do yours first, and then I will.
Not an issue.
Are you sure?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, there's just a couple others in the chat. I'll make sure we get to those, and we'll come right back to you. Please keep your hand raised so that I don't forget.
Will do.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the next question in the chat or in the Q&A session is any on ground waste management actions that actually work directly with recovered damaged fishing gear. So I think the question is trying to get here at whether or not there are any solutions that actually do work in the region. And I know this is a complicated question depending on where you are. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to take a quick stab at answering that question.
Joel, please repeat that question again. Thanks.
So the question is around whether there are any ground waste management actions that actually work directly with recovered or damaged fishing gear. So outside of the region, I can say that there are a lot of the gear is made of modern plastic. It can be recycled if you can have. But the thing is, that is true in theory, and that does work in practice in some regions. But you need to have a facility where you can actually process that type of material. The material needs to have a certain level of cleanliness in order to be put into a recycling stream. And there's a transportation and distribution network that needs to be set up. It's not an easy question. But I think particularly they're asking if anything is actually present in the Caribbean region that anyone's aware of. So Fadilah, yeah, please go ahead.
It's not necessarily within the Caribbean, but I know recently through a regional meeting, I found out about work that is being done in Costa Rica. And essentially what they are doing is that they are essentially for fishing line and nets, ropes, that sort of thing. They are essentially they're milling it down into smaller products, but using it as the raw material to make various tiles or flooring. So that is something. I do know that in Trinidad and Tobago, there is an company called Flying Tree Environmental. They've been doing that with just general plastics, plastic bottles, bags, that sort of thing. But they have been looking into how can they, more on a pilot level, because they essentially use various plastics and create something known as lumber, so that they then can use to create benches, picnic tables, doors, furniture, various blocks. And in speaking to that engineer, he was talking about, instead of trying to break down fishing line, which is essentially intended to be very strong, it's like, how can you use the tensile properties and essentially use fishing line to replicate steel? And then, so it is something that is being sort of investigated in a small level, but I do know of it more in a larger level in Costa Rica, which is adjacent to our region, but I do know on a very small scale it's being sort of piloted.
Thanks, Fadilah. Yeah, and I think that it's important to point out, as you've done, that sometimes you need to think outside the box depending on where you are, and look for solutions that will be a little bit more applicable locally. I've heard of nets, for example, being used as a strengthener in concrete to replace rebar, to add flexibility and things like that in different parts of the world. That these things have been tested. I don't think many of them are at scale now, but that actually leads quite well into Peter Randall's question also in the Q&A, and Fadilah, specifically for you, a comment rather than a question. The Ocean Country Partnership Program, or the OCPP, is currently exploring the issue of ALDFG in the Maldives, which has similar issues to the Caribbean, lack of facilities, transport issues, etc. OCPP has had some success in Sri Lanka, which is sort of adjacent, where fishers are being educated to the value of end-of-life fishing gear and the potential that there are economic benefits to bringing it ashore, which is true, as we've said, if you have a way to recycle it and you have this transportation distribution network. So the positives appearing are secondary economy for poor fishing communities, which has been demonstrated in parts of South America as well, especially when fishing is seasonal, and work opportunities for ladies to get involved with recycling end-of-life fishing gear projects to tourists. So I don't know, Fadilah, if you had a quick response to that, or Peter, if you're still here, whether or not you had anything else you'd like to add. Why don't we start with you, Fadilah?
I think, yes, it's really helpful. That comment is definitely something to look into, especially given the lack of facilities on a transport issue. So it'd be good for us to see what were the sort of measures and strategies that were used to accommodate that. And I do acknowledge that there are a couple comments in the chat that sort of look to what are potential solutions for addressing this sort of transport issue. But Peter, do you have anything that you wanted to add, or even just make more awareness of in terms of your work with CFAS?
Yeah, I can do. I mean, the main piece of work we were doing is basically interviewing fishermen. We were running a questionnaire because, as you know, you clearly stated earlier, you've got to have the fishermen engaged in anything that you're doing. So one of the positives of that work is that when we return to the fishermen with some outreach and we present the results, we're presenting the results from data that's been collected by them. They've provided that data, so you hopefully get that engagement going. So on the back of that, we did a small project with a recycler, and effectively just really a couple of guys in a shed that were starting to do some recycling. And again, it was education and outreach, and it was enabling them to get around the country and just share their existence with fishers. So fishers started seeing there was an opportunity there. So if they brought their gear ashore rather than just dumping it on the beach on, you know, Sri Lanka, in some places, you know, the waste management plans are not great there. So and again, as I mentioned in there, fishing is seasonal. You've got a northeast monsoon, you've got southwest monsoon, so you've definitely got periods where the economy is good for the fishing communities, and then you've got seasons where it's more difficult. So this is a secondary economy as a possibility, letting them know that this isn't waste. There's a value to it, and getting that message across. And one of the nice sidelines of this piece of work was that it opened up opportunities for ladies to get involved with recycling. So there's some kind of, as you mentioned, with the kind of lumber stuff, they're doing similar stuff like that, but on smaller scales, where you do key rings in the shape of a turtle or a fridge magnet in the shape of a shark. I kind of really like the idea that you're getting tourists to remove your waste. I think it's a lovely concept. But also the ladies are weaving bags, mostly from the rope from a variety of gear, and they are really high quality bags. You know, it's something a tourist will buy. And again, you know, add a little shark key ring to it, or an elephant key ring to it, and it appeals. So we're literally we're writing the report up for that now, and hopefully we're going to be publishing it in the near future. We're trying to do it in the Maldives as well. We're using the model that we've used in Sri Lanka, but of course in the Maldives we've got that complication of geography. Possibly added complication there is the fact that Maldives is a Muslim community. So, you know, the cultural dynamic is there, and the geography, and the fact that, like a lot of places, fishing is a male-dominated industry. Some of the ladies are involved in fishing processing, so potentially we could be opening up their eyes to, again, this recycling as another possible economic stream. But it's real early days. We're literally just doing the survey work in the Maldives, so hopefully it will be as successful as Sri Lanka, and we might get past some of those barriers.
And just a quick question, Peter, in terms of the recycling efforts that you're referring to in Sri Lanka and Maldives, are you suggesting like these sort of weaving and creating keychains, baskets? Is that the form of recycling that you're referring to, or are they actually creating some products and exporting externally?
There's a combination. So there's the local stuff that I've described, so it's very much there for the tourist market. But there is other material, and it's terrible, but when it comes to the various plastic compounds, but there is other material that basically stocking until there's enough to get past that transport issue. And, you know, like many of the small scale recyclers, things go off to plastics or go off to aquafill. So it's all about compression and making it as economically viable as to send it out there. I believe that looking at a recycler in Thailand, and I've frequently kind of hear through the grapevine that this is where some of the sports trainers companies get some of their recycled plastic and add that to the mix as well. So there's a combination of streams there, but literally just they've started small scale within country, and this has kind of enabled them now to look at that international market, which hopefully will get past the carbon footprint kind of issues and make it economically viable.
Thanks very much, Peter. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's others who are doing something similar as well. Sort of the Stand Up for Environment Restoration initiative in Nigeria has created a loom to weave fibers from nets and rope that they find on their shores into quite stunning footwear, which could fetch a high price. So I think, thinking outside the box is definitely something we'll need to do in the Caribbean region as well, because those traditional recycling pathways are just not currently feasible, I would say, with the infrastructure present and the transportation considerations. I'm going to hit the last question that we had in the original Q&A here before. I know there are some others in the chat as well, before we open to those who had raised their hands. And this is from Nigel Gibbs. Questions are being answered, but there are two that he would like to have answered. First, what data is there, or are there any interventions you end with capacity building regarding ALDFG in relation to marine mammal interactions? I would say that marine mammal interactions, we have done work that is related to that from the GGGI's perspective, not in the Caribbean yet, but we have done it in other areas of the world where there are whale entanglement issues, you know, testing on-demand gear, those types of things. I haven't done anything like that in the Caribbean, but I'd open it up to our panelists or anyone else to see whether or not that has been done in the Caribbean region, to your knowledge.
To my knowledge, no, but we are in touch with a sort of major effort in the Caribbean focused on whale research, the Caribbean Cetacean Society. And as far as I'm aware, they haven't, in their work, they've been doing surveys and expeditions throughout the entire region. I don't believe they've reported on any cases of entanglement. That's not to say that it's not occurring, but that's as much as I know. I'm not sure if anyone else has any awareness.
All right. Anyone else, feel free to raise your hand or jump in if you have anything to say about that. I'll move on to the second part of that question is, in tracking abandoned or lost gear, is the data gathered from questionnaires, or is there a formal legal reporting mechanism being considered based on fisheries acts that you have encountered? Is this a mandate based on the scale of gear? So From the global perspective, there are relatively few mandated gear loss reporting systems. There is quite a robust one in Canada. There's another one in Norway. There are a few scattered around. I believe there may also be one in Costa Rica, which is as close as to the region of those three. There are considerations on how to actually do that and to make it applicable. So I would say there are models for that, but doing that on a local, sort of a smaller scale, depending on whether it's something that would be on a nation by nation basis or whether that would be something that's sort of pan-Caribbean, I don't know. I don't know if any of our panelists have any thoughts about that. Peter, I see you've raised your hand. So
you asked a question about mandates for reporting. To the best of my knowledge, then they are non-existent. However, countries have the potential to put it in place as an administrative thing, because a number of the countries, especially the OECS countries that have conditions of license or conditions of registration as a part of their legislation, there is the potential to make something like that a condition of registration. So while, as far as I know, it doesn't exist right now, but there is scope and potential for it to occur. Just thought I'll see that. While I have the floor, let me address two points I made in the chat, if I may. One, I wanted to ask a question because there's some security people in the meeting here. People like Impacts and the RSS who have a role in security. I'm wondering whether they see a role for entities like that in supporting the implementation of the action plan. I think very often we don't make the linkages, and I think it's very important to make these linkages. Another comment is that the Western Central Atlantic Fisheries Commission has been trying for about 6 or more years to put forward a recommendations to do with the marking of fishing gear as a means of supporting dealing with ghost gear. What has happened is that there has not been traction and buy-in by a number of the countries, so the draft recommendations have not actually gone through and come out of the WCAF story. And that is another important challenge you have to bear in mind, that when we're talking about things like that at a regional level, the 38 countries, for example, that make up WCAF, or the 39, the extent to which these efforts can be supported by the types of statements of policy, though not binding, but can guide. I just thought I'd drop these 2 points into the mix. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Yes, both points very well taken. And Viren, I think this is probably a good time to have you hop in. Apologies for earlier. Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter, for bringing that up. I just want to, first of all, congratulate the CRFM and really thank them for framing this as a regional issue with their action plan. I want to put it out there that we need to also look at this as a regional security issue, because abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear is something that has an effect on security, because the fishing gear continues to fish and destroys the environment. It presents a problem. And it's important to remember that the security entities in the region have the ability to operate beyond borders and in ways and with resources that other agencies often don't. So in framing this, it's important to think of it as a transboundary issue that can be addressed by security entities. And we absolutely support the action plan. However, we would also like to have a look at it and get some of our points in there. And there is, I want to mention one other thing that came up in terms of tracking. We have had a lot of success using AIS tracking in the region. And I know, and I'm seeing a lot of my colleagues online who are members of the Blue Justice Caribbean Hub and working with other tracking systems in the region that track fishing vessels and other types of vessels. But AIS provides a very cost-effective solution to tracking fishing gear. And once that fishing gear, it also is an open source solution. So once that fishing gear crosses borders, it can be actioned across borders by other entities, and it continues to remain a regional issue that we can deal with and address. And I want to put it out there that AIS is something that we should definitely be looking into when dealing with tracking gear. All right? I hope Peter's happy with that.
No, Peter. Yes, of course, Peter.
Yeah,
Please do.
it's okay. It's okay. He addressed what I wanted to address. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. No, I think that's a good point. And I know that AIS has been used to track gear in a couple of other geographies as well, with both some pros and some cons to that, which I don't think we'll dive into any depth here, simply because we have more questions to get through. But yes, I would appreciate if you could provide some feedback into the regional action plan from that perspective. That's something that we haven't had input in for up to this point. So yes, I think that would be great. One next question I had was actually from the chat, I believe. With respect to the issue of travel cost, can CRFM establish some form of treaty with one of the airline companies as a means to meet the social responsibility aspect of the sustainability development goals agenda in order to meet our present regional objectives? Probably not a question for me. However, that said, I think that it's an interesting point. There have been looked at, for example, I know on the west coast of Canada, potentially looking at the Canadian Coast Guard, who has vessels going up and down the coast from time to time. When they go up and they come back down the coast empty, could they be used as a transportation point to bring it to a central node where that gear can then be processed or recycled? So looking at alternate ways of addressing travel costs, and again, thinking outside the box is a potential way to do that. I know that if you're looking at recycling gear in particular, and you're dealing with one of the companies that Peter Randall had mentioned, either Plastiques or Aquafil, they tend to have existing deals with the larger shipping companies, so you might be able to piggyback onto those types of things. I don't know how relevant that necessarily would be to the region, but I appreciate the perspective there about looking at things a little bit outside the box. Don't know if any of our panelists have any thoughts on that particular piece.
Just a quick note, Joel.
Yes.
I mean, it's a good point. We are always faced with economies of scale if we're talking about recycling, how cost effective it would be for small islands to do that. And we might be able to consolidate on one island and move all the products to the next island. Again, these are we're still baffling with the transportation issues within countries, not just we're now talking about the abandoned gears movement, but we are still trying to struggle with movement of people, movement of tourism, movement of agriculture and fisheries products. It was mentioned in one of the presentations to go from Grenada to St. Vincent. It's kind of very expensive, So at the CARICOM level, we're trying to address this, and we have been dealing with this since the end of COVID. How we are going to address this. Now we have put another thing in the mix that we need to think about, and that is, how do we think about, or when we are thinking about the recycling, how it is that we're going to do it as small islands? Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, again, it depends whether you're talking about the sort of more traditional recycling and turning things into pellets, or whether you're talking about finding just a second purpose or a second use for that material in a local context. And I think either of those are viable options, depending on what you are trying to do. But absolutely, all of those questions and considerations need to be taken in. And I don't think we have firm answers to those yet, but hopefully, small pilots usually lead to larger, at least lessons learned, so we can take a look at some of those moving forward. There's a couple of other questions that I'm going to try to get to in the chat. One, using organic materials for fishing gear is a great idea. There are some promising plastic or alternatives to plastic, such as bioplastic, natural fibers, seaweed-based materials. Interestingly, in Grenada, some landscapers have been known to repurpose discarded fishing line as makeshift string for cutting grass, but when it breaks down, it can lead to the creation of microplastics, highlighting the need for more sustainable solutions. Yes. That's another the point there, I think, being that when you do find these sort of alternative solutions for gear, whether that's a recycling or a repurposing, you want to make sure that you're not creating another issue at the same time. Although, the argument can be made that whether you're using fishing gear for that line to cut down grass, or whether you're using line that's designed to cut down grass, you're causing microplastics either way. But yes, it's a really good point that you want to make sure that any sort of potential solutions is thought through to the end stage, so that it's not inadvertently creating a different kind of a concern. And I see another question in the chat. Nothing that will go back to the fishing sector value chain, I gather from the answers. I think that's to do with recycling as well. At this point, nothing that I'm aware of, although if anyone else on the line from our panelists or anyone else on has a more to say about that in terms of nothing that's been recycled that is then being used in the fishing value chain. I've seen this happen in the UK, for example, where they have used recycled gear to create sort of bins to create more, to put in harbors to collect more recycled gear. I don't think there's anything like that currently happening in the Caribbean to my knowledge, but if anyone has anything they'd like to hop in with that, please do.
I think in terms of the putting back into the fish sector, I interpreted the question as, for example, if fishers are collecting gear and then it's exported off, the value gain from that doesn't go back to the fishing sector. That's how I interpreted that question. But in terms of the sort of smaller scale interventions in terms of repurposing rather than recycling, it can go back into local communities, as Peter Randall mentioned, in terms of empowering the women fishers who might be involved in processes. It can stay within the general communities of fishing sectors. There is an example of, for example, with my work with lionfish, they used, and it's essentially it's a model that can be used for end-of-life fishing gear, in that they had lionfish being captured. They used the waste from the lionfish, which were the spines, empowered the women to make jewelry, and then that created more income. So that raised the value of the waste. So instead of it just being a food fish, the waste that was created through spines and tails now go on to make jewelry, and that makes it more valuable. And all the money that is gained from that stays within the community. It's not that it's being exported.
Great, thanks, Fadilah. That's very valuable information. I'm going to look at one last comment that we have here, and looking at operations in depth may be useful. Many fish pot fishers in Tobago try to make their gear as inconspicuous as possible due to theft. They paint the buoys dark gray so they cannot be seen. That increases the chances of being lost. The use of GPS coupled with the use of landmarks may increase retrieval success. Many fishers still just use landmarks. From our perspective, or from our experience as well, yes, we saw this something very similar in Belize. That fishers tend to be fishing in very shallow water. They tend to be very near their gear, and they generally don't mark it in quite the same way. So just a link to ways and reasons for marking, and theft was one of the particular, theft or sabotage actually was one of the reasons that they don't mark gear in such a conspicuous way. But I wanted to pivot this question maybe to Shellene, if you're still with us, Shellene. Do you have any thoughts on this based on the sort of linking back to the work that you've done in Jamaica, and the gear that was tested there with the rescue unit devices as a sort of a combination between an escape hatch and an emergency buoy, a brightly marked emergency buoy? I was just curious. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I thought maybe you might have some input into that particular question.
They did not want to attach any brightly colored buoys because they feared other fishers would come and steal their pots. This is a grave issue in Jamaica. I don't know if it is the same in the other Caribbean countries, but we have a lot of problems here with theft of fish pots. And so they liked the technology of the rescue units where the pots were sunken and only popped up when they had set the time for it to pop up. So that intervention was really accepted by our officials because it would have helped in with with theft of fish pots. They didn't want their pots to be seen, so they preferred it to be submerged.
Yeah, which was interesting as a result of that, because the rescue unit was meant to be an emergency buoy rather than a primary buoy. But in this particular case, it served its purpose as an unintended use case, I think, to sort of solve that issue. So I thank you for highlighting that, Shellene, because I wanted to make sure that was done, because it was something that we ran into, the thought of, or the fear of theft of their equipment being a barrier to gear marking is something that needs to be taken into consideration, I think, for sure. And I know that we are at time, but there is one other question that I wanted to pose to Daana, actually, is something that I had noticed in your presentation. I've been fascinated by your work for a while. You had mentioned that the indirect estimation of gill nets, I believe, was somewhere in the neighborhood of 530,000 kilograms lost annually, just in Trinidad and Tobago. That's a really interesting figure. I mean, gill nets tend to be lighter, I think, than most other forms of fishing, a lot of other forms of fishing gear as well. So that's a big amount for Trinidad and Tobago. And I had a question for you, is in terms of that, that gill net also tends to be very highly rated in terms of its potential for loss and its impact once it is lost. It tends to entangle quite a few things. Do you have any thoughts on that and what that actually means for the region? And like, what do you see as the next steps now that we have some of this information, and sort of seeing the largest amount of gear loss in Trinidad and Tobago being sort of the highest potential for environmental impacts? What does that mean to you, and what do you think is the next step that needs to be taken based on your research to date?
Thanks for that question, Joel. So if you noticed in my presentation, I did not pay much attention to the numbers, because with every single method that we use, there were limitations. So I sort of presented the direct method, and then I also presented the indirect method, but I didn't quote the numbers. I just told you the trend. So the trend that we are seeing is that, gill nets from a single vessel, the majority, that's the most amount of plastics that you're going to get being emitted into the environment as a result of ALDFG. The reason I didn't pay attention to numbers, and I didn't want people to quote numbers, is because there are limitations associated with each of the methods. Even when we're scaling up from one vessel to like all the vessels that are using this gear, again, there are limitations with that data. But the reality remains is that based on our estimations, gill nets are contributing the most amount of plastics, if we compare to the other gear types. What I think that sort of puts us in a place to do is that, and I spoke about prioritization and triage, is that is where potentially you would want to focus your attention. So if it is that you're trying to prevent the loss of gill nets, minimize, mitigate, or even in terms of remediation efforts. So there are areas, for example, in the Gulf of Paria, that's the body of water between Venezuela and Trinidad, where there are known wrecks and there are known areas where, you have gill nets being present in the water. If you had to prioritize, maybe these are the things that you would want to prioritize, because as you very well know, resources are limited when you're working in the Caribbean, even more so. So I think that's where I want to comment on that. So I know you honed in on the numbers. I'm not so focused on the numbers per se, but just to say that we have evidence that this is the thing, Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. KANHAI. And actually, the purpose of me pointing out that number was to have you give that exact response, to be perfectly honest with you, because it is so difficult to take that and extrapolate that. And we've seen some of the work that's been done by Dr. Richardson, Kelsey Richardson, which you mentioned earlier as well, which took some sampling from around the world using these surveys and trying to scale that up on a global level. And the margin of error in doing that is quite significant, but it gives you an idea of where to look and what to prioritize, as you say. And I wanted to make sure that came through in that. It doesn't necessarily mean that these are finite things, but this is something where this is all about guidance and direction of where you need to try to find your intervention points. And that's what I was talking about. Like, what do you see as the next step here? Like, where do we need to go from here? I know you've done the gap, or you and Tricia have done the gap analysis. And what do you think from your perspective? And I open this up to all of the panelists. I know we're running a little bit over time, but one final thing I wanted to ask everyone here was, what do you think is the most obvious next step? Where do we go from here? Is it to build on the work that's already been done? Is there a specific path that you think? Is it more policy related, or is it too early to tell? And apologies to put everyone on the spot there with this question. I just want to try to frame the next sort of, if we're talking about the work that's been done, we're talking about this regional action plan. What do we want to do with it? What do we feel is the next logical place to take this? And is it scaling up and expanding some of these projects and learning more about what's going on in some of these different islands, or not just the island nations, but within these different member states within the Caribbean? Does anybody have any thoughts on where we should go from here? Peter, I see your hand is up, so please join in the debate.
Thank you. A quick response to your question. I think the issue of information and education is primary. Very often we take directions and Joe Fisher doesn't really get it. He has not been involved to the extent that he understands the why and the wherefore. So I think that's a very important one. I think we also need to consider appropriateness. And what was just brought up there from the Trinidad example, for me, is a key point. You see a trend in a particular country. That doesn't necessarily mean that is the same problem for the CRFM 17 other member states, for week after 39 other countries. We have to look to the extent to which we are relevant in each particular jurisdiction and not necessarily see broad brush one color paint is useful for everybody. For me, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. That acceptance, not just recognition, because we recognize it now, but often we don't, acceptance of the fact that we need to take different approaches. And the gillnet one always comes to my mind as a classic example. Not all gillnets are created equal. And some of the things we call gillnets in one place may not be called a gillnet in another. So when you use the term and you bring it to my jurisdiction, we're not talking about the same thing. So that is why we need to find a way to be able to zoom in on the aspect of the action plan that is most relevant to a particular jurisdiction. And that is what we take forward. That is what we build the public awareness on, rather than these broad brush approaches which not necessarily follow. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Yep, absolutely. Fadilah, I had seen that you would come off mute. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you had more to add to that, then please do.
Yeah, I think I would say that I agree with sort of expanding on current projects, well, building on the work that we've already done. I think for us, we took that sort of approach. We started in for the Fisher-led ALDFG awareness program. We started in 2 countries. Now we're at 5. And in terms of, I think there was a comment in the chats about the merit of the awareness drive and what steps, policies, or frameworks can we likely implement to ensure buy-in from fishers throughout the region to minimize. I think more of this work is really, I think awareness is essentially the biggest step in creating that buy-in, having them aware but also involved in the process, having the work focused for their livelihoods. I think that increases the aggressive buy-in. The other reality that we've spoken of, depending on the type of gear, for a lot of fishers, they don't want to lose their gear. So anything that they can do to prevent the loss of the gear there is that buy-in. Obviously, there are cases of theft. There are cases of illegal fishing. Those are the sort of more intentional causes of gear loss. But in terms of the sort of accidental cases, I do believe that there is that buy-in as a result of education. But then equally, there is that need, that's sort of more of a bottom-up approach, but I think there is also need from the top-down approach in terms of getting decision makers also aware of making this a priority, especially when it comes to, especially now that we hopefully have this global plastics agreement, and then also making ALDFG, because there will be the need for sort of local ratification of that agreement, but then also making ALDFG be a part of it, not just a single-use plastics, but also making that making policymakers, decision makers be aware that ALDFG is a important issue that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Fadilah. Yeah, and I think that's a great place to end this current webinar. Is on that note, there does need to be a global policy framework as well. We've been working on that, trying to make sure that ALDFG is included. But I think there's a lot of room left for discussion here. I want to be mindful and respectful of everyone's time, as we are already 10 minutes overdue. But what this tells me, and I think what this tells everybody else here, is that there's a lot of discussion to be had. So I want to thank our esteemed panelists again for taking the time out of their very busy schedules to be here to present today, and thank the CRFM for co-hosting this webinar with us. I'm hoping that there's a lot of interest that's built from this for the second one, which will happen in 1 month's time. More information on that will follow. And for those who are still here, thank you for taking the time out of your day. We've had some really good engagement. I hope to answer some more of these questions and bring up others in the discussion on the next webinar in 1 month's time. For those of you who are able, please take a look at the materials for this webinar, which were shared in the link earlier. And if you can download the Regional Action Plan and have a look at it. Again, it's been a few years since it's been looked at, so please update with any comments or anything. We will try to take as many of those into consideration as we can. If you can send those back our way, so that we can come prepared to discuss it in a little bit more detail, not only in its current state, but some of the feedback that we hopefully receive between now and then. That would be ideal. So thank you very much again to our panelists, to the CRFM, to everyone for attending. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much, Adele, for posting that link one more time in the chat there. And we will be reaching out to all of you again shortly with more information about the next webinar in this series. Thank you again for all the work that you do. Take good care. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye, everyone.
folks. Bye.